Sometimes you don't realize how poorly functioning you are until you fix it. There are areas of hypometabolism that occur in mental illness. So if I've got parts of my brain that cannot use glucose for fuel well anymore, then I'm starving my brain of energy that it needs to function. There is never a time that insulin is low enough that I can make an alternative fuel known as ketones. And so I'm starving my brain. My brain can't do basic housekeeping, constantly under duress. It starts to downregulate higher functions. I work with a lot of wonderful researchers, and one of them said something that really surprised me. We were probably always supposed to be in ketosis most of the time in our evolutionary history, and it might be that the ketones were actually organ stabilizers. So being in ketosis might be one of the ways in which our body maintains homeostasis in our organs, including our brain. I work with a lot of people with serious mental illness, but I also want to say, if you feel like your brain is meh, it's okay, it's good, it might be worth it to switch fuel sources and see how your brain feels on ketones. You might be a race car using the wrong fuel and not even know it.
Do me a quick favor, check and see if you're subscribed to the show. If not, hit that subscribe button. It's a simple and free way to help me out. And for you, you're going to be more likely to see future episodes on YouTube, and you're going to join the growing community. It's a win-win all around. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Let's get into the show. Nicole, for somebody that hasn't made the connection yet between mental illness and what they're putting in their mouth, let's start out really broad and talk about why what we eat matters for our brain health.
So very, very broadly, something that people really can't quite or don't understand because they haven't really been educated about it, or it hasn't been the focus of education, is that your ability to make energy in your brain, and for your brain to have good mitochondrial health and to have all the micronutrients it needs and the amino acids it needs in order to make your neurotransmitters and fight neuroinflammation, food directly affects that. Your choices directly affect that. And that is foundational and preventative and something that our society just has not paid attention to at all. This idea that what we eat is completely disconnected from how we are functioning or what we're able to handle or what our capacity is not reflective of how the human brain and the human body work.
Well, there's a lot of information out there, a lot of conflicting information on what to eat in general. How does somebody begin to piece together a diet to heal the brain?
The first thing that you really need to do is you need to understand the limitations of different research models. And that might seem like a very counterintuitive place to begin, but it's actually very, very important, because many of the things that we are told to eat or are told that have benefit actually come from epidemiological studies. And epidemiological studies, by their very nature, are hypothesis generating. They are not an area of scientific inquiry that is supposed to inform guidelines. They're not made for that. And part of that is because the way data is accumulated for epidemiological studies are in ways such as food frequency questionnaires, where, for example, if someone asked you or I what we ate that week, we would have a heck of a time telling them what it was and exactly how much. And it would be very general. And so, if you had a hot dog, it wouldn't, we wouldn't know what brand it was or what quality of meat it was or any, things like that. And so, how much broccoli did you have on your plate, and so on and so forth. So these food frequency questionnaires are flawed by definition. And then we make these very general recommendations based on that. The other thing that really, really, really must stop is picking food choices based on, I would say, ideas about what is morally a high ground. So we can talk more about that because I think that is fascinating and very interesting. But there's sometimes these epidemiological studies are used by special interest groups to promote a particular agenda that may not actually be consistent with what we understand about human biology. And so that's another piece. So really, you have to kind of understand what your studies are based on. And I really like to make my recommendations based on what we know about human biochemistry as opposed to epidemiological studies. Or, I'm very particular about, okay, so whose agenda does this study promote? And is that based in human biochemistry, or is that based on some kind of agenda about how they want or think the world should work?
Okay, so somebody brand new to this, they want to start to head in the direction we're alluding to here. How do you recommend they begin? Is it with macros, eliminating certain foods, including certain foods? Let's walk into it from the beginning and give the full playbook.
So the very, very first thing that people can do who want to walk into this is to understand that a lot of the foods on the shelves, what's called highly processed foods, are more like drugs than food. So they have to stop thinking about those as food and think about them much more as substances. There's substances that are sold commercially in the guise of food. And so my personal definition of what a food is does it feed my body? Does it increase my micronutrient stores? Does it provide me usable amino acids? Does it nurture me, or does it take away from my vitality in some way, shape, or form? And so when you put that bar to highly processed foods, it fails miserably. So what I would want your listeners to understand is that a lot of the highly processed foods, a lot of them use proteins, for example, that are not very bioavailable. Many of them are so high in carbohydrates that they actually deplete micronutrient stores of things like magnesium and thiamine. And so you're actually worse off nutritionally after eating them than you were when you began. There's also a lot of concerns about some of the highly processed industrialized oils and fats that are used in these highly processed foods. And here in the US, there are a lot of chemicals and substances and flavorings and things that have been banned elsewhere around the world for very good reason, that our government, for some reason, and I won't expound on that, but there's some reason that we're not being protected from that in our food supply. And so if there was just one thing I could have someone do for their mental health that hopefully would not be overwhelming, would be to start to think about these substances in that way so that they can start to move them out of their diet and to actually replace them with whole foods. And some people think about those highly processed food substances as a major source of pleasure, right? Like some people are really struggling, and those highly processed foods are how they try to regulate their own brain chemistry in the moment without an understanding of what the downstream effects of that decision are. But I would say if anyone is having any kind of motivational issue around getting rid of those substances, it's really important to remember that your drug dealer really doesn't have your best interest at heart. They really just want your money. They don't understand or they don't care, I should say. I'm sure they understand. They don't care how disruptive that is to your mood and functioning an hour later or 2 to 3 days later. Your drug dealer doesn't care about you, and they don't care about your quality of life. And so if you feel some allegiance to that drug dealer who is a highly processed food seller, then that's something that you need to kind of address and think about really carefully. Those are not your friends.
Okay, so first step, ultra processed foods, they're out. Seed oils in that category, we want to remove those.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned going to Whole Foods. For somebody that's tried that, still not seeing the results when it comes to their mental health, what's the next step?
So a whole foods diet, a good quality paleo type of diet, a lot of people, it's actually very abundant in carbohydrate, and sometimes that's just what people need, and they're doing just fine with it. And they don't need to look at different diets necessarily. But the next step down, I would say, if you are not getting mood stability, and I also want to say, sometimes you don't realize how poorly functioning you are until you fix it. And so there's lots of people on paleo diets that are feeling better than they did before they got rid of highly processed foods and stuff, but they still aren't actually aware that there's a whole nother next level that they could be feeling better at. And so I encourage anyone listening to be like curious about, ooh, what's possible for me, because that is kind of a fun thing to explore. So the next step would be to get a low carb food list. And I would say just eat off of that low carb food list. If it's not on that food list, you don't eat it. You're not counting macros. You're not counting calories. You're not counting, checking whether you got enough protein or too little or whatever. You just are reducing carbohydrate intake overall, just eating simply off of a low carb food list. You think about that food list when you dine at a restaurant, that sort of thing.
When it comes to carbs, let's pause here and talk about why having too many of them impact the brain in a negative way.
In our food culture and in our food supply, since the 1970s or so, there has been a consistent increase in the amount of carbohydrates that are added to our food supply. And our increase, there's sugar in just about everything. So basically what happens, and a lot of people aren't aware of this, but I feel like it should just be on the news every night. But what ends up happening is, because we have a very, very high carbohydrate diet since childhood on, what happens is we develop something called insulin resistance. So insulin is the hormone that is used to bring energy from carbohydrates into the cells. And our body really does not want a lot of sugar or glucose in our bloodstream at any one time. It wants 1 teaspoon. So imagine you drink a slushie, right? Like, your body is desperately trying to get that glucose out of your bloodstream into the cells to be burned for energy, because it's trying to protect you from it. We actually do not need to eat carbohydrates or glucose. We actually have a mechanism called gluconeogenesis that happily makes all the glucose substrate we need. It is not a burden to our body to provide that substrate. And so the body really does not benefit from huge amounts of carbohydrate. That is a substrate that it really wants to regulate on its own, and it does it beautifully, and it does it dynamically. And so what ends up happening is we develop insulin resistance, and not just in our peripheral tissues, but also insulin is important in its ability to be used within the brain. So there are parts of the brain, or the blood-brain barrier, for example, that becomes insulin resistant. And what ends up in mental illness is glucose hypometabolism. So if you thumbed through the DSM-5 and you looked at all the different mental illnesses, and then you go on scholar.google.com and you look up the disorder name with the term glucose hypometabolism or hypometabolism, you will see that every single one of those has research to support that there are areas of hypometabolism that occur in mental illness. So if I've got parts of my brain that cannot use glucose for fuel well anymore, and I have a nice big carbohydrate meal, and my insulin is also high because I have hyperinsulinemia, then I'm starving my brain of energy that it needs to function for several hours, possibly not for that whole day, right? Because if I never stop eating those carbohydrates, I don't stop snacking on those fruit roll-ups or whatever, right? Then there is never a time that insulin is low enough that I can make an alternative fuel known as ketones. Okay? And so I'm starving my brain. So if I'm starving my brain of energy, my brain can't do basic housekeeping. It's constantly under duress. It starts to downregulate higher functions and goes more towards lower survival functions, right? And that's consistent with this really amazing theory that is coming out of the research literature called the allostatic triage theory of psychopathology. So you should have some guests on talking about that because it is groundbreaking and such a better model than the DSM-5. But it talks about that. So if you're starving for energy, of course your capacity is low. Of course your ability to be creative and expand into the world and do things and feel not overwhelmed by unloading the dishwasher is impacted. And so people just really kind of don't understand how profound managing carbohydrate intake is to a sense of well-being for people.
Let's talk more about the physiology here because we're talking about consuming too many carbs, having a lot of blood glucose, but yet the brain is starving. You mentioned the blood-brain barrier there. Let's talk about when it comes to metabolism in the brain, why there it's a special instance and different than the rest of the body.
I'm not sure it's a special instance. I think that all of your tissues really suffer when insulin resistance takes hold in them. So Ben Bickman is a wonderful insulin researcher, and he talks about how as different tissues develop insulin resistance, people develop chronic illnesses, PCOS, right? Things like that. And so I think it hurts your whole body, but in the brain specifically, the issue is that once your brain starts to starve for energy, it begins to attempt to use different pathways to make energy out of desperation. And those pathways are particularly dirty and messy and cause a lot of oxidative stress, which then compounds the issue. And so your brain metabolism and paying attention to your brain metabolism and making sure that you have a nice, steady fuel source can be absolutely life-changing to people who are suffering from mental illness.
Right. I didn't want to downplay the insulin resistance through the body. I totally agree. But the blood-brain barrier aspect, when it comes to the brain, is an additional adjunct we need to consider.
Oh, yeah.
And to me, the other piece is the fact that fatty acids don't work well in the brain for energy like the rest of the body.
Let's kind of talk about that. So when I say eat off of a low carb food list, right? As that being the next step, that might work for many people. That might be next level for them, and they may find an improvement in capacity and mood that they just have never experienced before, and that might be their done deal, and they're good, and they're off and thriving in the world. But then there's also people who need a little bit more of a structured ketogenic diet, or what we would call ketogenic metabolic therapy specifically. And the reason for that is because exactly that, you can't fuel a brain just on fatty acids alone. And so in the world of epilepsy, for example, your ketone levels matter, and your ability to utilize fatty acids and turn them into ketone bodies as a direct fuel for the brain absolutely matters. And it's because of things like the blood-brain barrier and the ability of ketone bodies to diffuse very easily into neurons and surrounding structures and be used for fuel. And so when we implement something like ketogenic metabolic therapy, which is, for some people, it is just eating. I mean, it can really be that simple because I want to do a caveat because we're talking about the different levels, right? And I don't want people to think that everybody needs a dietitian formulated ketogenic metabolic therapy, count your macros, count your per meal macros, all that kind of stuff. Because there are plenty of case reports of individuals just simply eating off of a low carb food list and recovering from lifelong schizophrenia. Like that actually happens. And it happens often. But some people actually do need to regulate how many carbohydrates they eat per meal, how much protein they eat per meal, in order to get their ketone levels up and keep them up so that they can have a steady source of fuel for their brain. And that is a really big healing part of a lot of people's journeys on using KMT for mental illness.
For people that do find success in being on keto for their mental health, you mentioned ketone levels. How high do you like to see those?
That's a big discussion right now in the metabolic psychiatry world, both among patients and among practitioners. And the most recent Delphi consensus kind of said between 1 and 3, 1 and 4, something like that. But we do want people kind of consistently, hanging out, I would say about 1. 0.5 is great. 0.5 is nutritional ketosis. And like I said, there's people who get remission from serious mental illness just hanging out at those levels without any issues. But there's lots of people who seem to really do better at higher levels, and we don't know the mechanism by which some people need those higher levels and some don't.
Okay. Building off of ketone levels here, somebody wanting to build a ketogenic diet for mental health versus for weight loss, reversal of diabetes, is it different the way you go about putting that together?
It's different the way I put it together, yes. So in the epilepsy world, I will say that they are not afraid of gluten, and they will construct low-carb breads and low-carb treats and their medical food, and those are used in the epilepsy population. And people get better and people get seizure control, and that's fantastic. But when I construct ketogenic diets for people for brain health, there are absolutely no grains and there are no glutens. And so that's an important piece, I think, just because I think that there's enough research literature to make us a little bit nervous around gluten, even for people who do not have celiac disease. I still think that there's enough research to show that it disrupts the blood-brain integrity, barrier integrity. And so why would I say yes, go ahead and have all that gluten when I'm trying to heal your brain? It just seems like a no-brainer to me, but I'm not an epilepsy dietitian. And so I do that, and then I construct it with whole foods, nutrient dense. I think that animal foods can be very, very valuable when you're trying to heal a brain because of the nutrient density and the bioavailability of animal products in a ketogenic diet. Some people do dairy on their ketogenic diet and some people don't. Some people come into their ketogenic diet with lots of food intolerances that get better over time. And I think that might be because one of the ketone bodies is beta hydroxybutyrate. And what do we tell people to do to make more butyrate in their gut, right? Fiber and that kind of thing. But I think that when people are on ketogenic diets, that the beta hydroxybutyrate provides a consistent butyrate fuel for the gut. And I think that also helps heal up the blood-brain barrier. And so really ketogenic diets are have pleiotropic effects. So while ketogenic diets have medication-like effects, truly, they shouldn't really be thought about as a diet. They really should be thought about as an intervention that has medication-like effects. But they actually go beyond that because they work on so many different systems in positive, enhancing ways that they really are very much a root cause sort of intervention.
Okay, hypothetical patient working with you. Somebody saying, I am just sick and tired of my mental health being in the pits. I want to do this 100%. How would you suggest somebody build that diet out? You've talked about dairy, you've talked about the grains. We don't want any grains, no gluten. But how low do we bring the carbs down? Let's get into specifics of somebody that just says, Nicole, I'm with you. Tell me what to do.
Well, it's kind of funny because those are really the only people I work with. They're they're like, just tell me what to do. I'm ready to go. So, so the first thing I do is I make them track their food, and I encourage them to develop that skill, and I like to see a full 3 to 7 days worth of data of how they currently eat, and that's actually very helpful because I can see if they're currently getting enough protein. I can just kind of see their eating habits, right? I can see how much energy they generally are eating. I can see their patterns. And so they come to me, they learn how to track, and then they have that beautiful tracking skill for when we actually do need them to start to manage their per meal macros, for example, or their daily macros. And then, I construct it. I mean, I don't know how much detail you want. Are we making a do-it-yourself kind of video here for people, or what's the thought?
I'm just curious, and I know people will be
Oh,
curious too. We'll add in later, talk about the importance of working with somebody when you go about doing this, especially if you're on medication.
oh,
So we'll
yeah,
make sure and get into that later.
yeah,
But for somebody who right now has brain fog and they just want to take this and get their brain functioning as well as it can.
yeah,
So they're not on medication, they're not in a life-threatening situation right now.
right.
But they say, Nicole, I'm a high producing entrepreneur. I want to function the best I can for a lifetime. Give me the diet. What do I do?
So after you track your food for a good week and we get an idea of how many carbohydrates you are used to eating, then the next thing we do is we talk about the different ways that you're going to start to titrate those carbohydrates down for therapeutic carbohydrate restriction. So if you track and I see that you are used to 300 grams of carbs a day, what I might do just to help ease your transition into your ketogenic diet and to begin to build the actual behavioral skills that you need to not just go keto suddenly and then forget to go to the grocery store and go off suddenly, right? So I like to see people sometimes titrate their carbohydrates down low. So I'll say, okay, next week, I want you to cut your carbohydrates in half. Here are some different swap outs, no more potatoes, you're a cauliflower man now, right? So different types of things that they can use to swap out, and see if you can get your carbs down to 150, right? And then we go down again half, and then we go down again half. And so by the time you do that, slowly you actually have a bunch of recipes that you have found that you like, and you've done some behavioral changes, and you know how to bring your lunch to work instead of, or you know how to order from the restaurant in such a way. And so I think that's actually very helpful to go down a little bit more slowly. Sometimes when people just transition down in a week or 2 weeks, they do not have the behavioral skills to sustain it. And then what you get is I'm on, I'm off, I'm on, I'm off, I'm on, I'm off. And that's actually really hard for people, because I think that can be really difficult for brain metabolism to do that. So yeah, we just start titrating down. And once they're able to get their carbohydrates down, we start talking about ways that they increase their fat, right? Healthy fats. Because the one thing that people do when they're not actually getting professional help doing this is they'll get really good at reducing their carbohydrates, but they don't offset that with an increase in healthy fats, and they get hungry and they start eating very, very low calorie, which kind of feels kind of good first because it gets their ketones up really high, right? But after a while of chronic undereating, they're not doing so well. They're not feeling so hot, and they're certainly not thinking good, right? And so, and maybe if someone has really a lot of body fat to lose, that's not a big deal. But really, for someone who is of a lower body fat percentage, that can be a problem and cause issues down the road. So that's that other behavioral piece. It's not just about reducing your carbohydrates. It's learning how to add healthy fats in to actually fuel your body and your brain.
Let's talk more about that piece. I really wanted to get into that with you because, like you said, people can bring the carbs down, and that can be a great first step. But long term, when they get to their healthy weight, building this diet in a way that'll be sustainable, I think that can be a tricky piece. How do we bring in more fat and get that ratio of macros right? So somebody confused, what would you say to them?
So I would say, for goodness sakes, if you are an adult with an adult body, please do not put yourself on a 4-to-1 ratio. That is for childhood epilepsy, and you will not get enough protein to sustain your adult body, and you do not need a 4-to-1. Unless your doctor or your dietitian thinks you do because you have a brain tumor or something very kind of extreme going on. But for mental health, we normally put people on a much more doable, lovely to eat ratio that's much more sustainable, for sure.
What do you mean by 4-to-1?
Oh my gosh, it's dietitian speak. It was like the hardest thing for me to learn out of everything. So 4-to-1. So the 4 is the fat ratio compared to carbohydrates and protein grams combined. And many people construct their ketogenic diets thinking in terms of percentages of calories, right? For example, but if someone works with a dietitian or someone trained in it like me, we'll figure that out and work that out with them. But to make it sustainable, yeah. So it's actually very easy once you think away from the sweet sauces that we're used to, the ketchup, the barbecue sauces and that kind of stuff, and you switch yourself over to a lot of really delicious fatty sauces. Do you know what is keto? Chimichurri with all that olive oil is keto, right? There's lots of beautiful dressings that are keto. There's a lot of, beurre blanc sauce, there's butter sauces, there's mayonnaise sauces, which doesn't sound good, but if you have a really good quality avocado or olive oil mayonnaise, it's delicious. And so you just have to start kind of thinking about how to add fat back in.
Okay, let's talk about the difference there between somebody burning body fat versus adding these fats in and how the metabolism adjusts.
Ideally, if you have body fat to lose, the ideal thing is to reduce your carbohydrates in such a way that your insulin levels drop and you're able to easily burn your own body fat for ketone production and for fuel. And that will happen. And at first, it takes a little while sometimes to get that insulin down well enough, but almost everybody can get into ketosis, burning their own body fat or ketones within 4 to 7 days. And then there's also some people who don't have a lot of body fat, or they just have a lot of high energy demands in their brain or in their body or both, and they do benefit from additional dietary fat. And you can overeat energy and you can overeat fat, and that can cause its own issues and problems. But if you're working with someone to help you design your diet, excuse me, that shouldn't be happening.
Is it safe to say somebody coming to this and they're also obese and they want to burn their own body fat, would holding off on adding the fats in till they get to their ideal weight make sense?
I would say no for mental illness, potentially, because like I said, if they're in a chronic high insulin state, it takes a little while for their body to get good at burning its own body fat. Insulin levels have to kind of drop a little bit consistently. A lot of people are on a lot of medications that make it that increase their blood glucose and can make it a little bit more difficult to make ketones from their own body fat. And so it would depend on the person and kind of what's going on.
And when you're working with somebody who, say, tried this on their own beforehand, what are the biggest dietary mistakes you see?
Assuming they are someone who needs a modified ketogenic diet or a modified ketogenic metabolic therapy, specifically to get their ketones up and keep them up to get treatment effects, the two things that happen often is they look at their whole day macros and they eat from that as they go. So that shouldn't be a problem, but for someone with a sensitive brain, or insulin resistance, sitting down and saving your 20 net grams of carbs all for dinner at one meal is going to spike insulin and drop ketone levels. And so someone's bringing me coffee. And so if they do that, that's going to shut down that energy supply, right? And if your brain is sensitive and it cannot handle that starvation of energy for 2 to 3 hours while we're waiting for your insulin levels to drop, that's a problem. And so breaking up those 20 net grams of carbs into about 6 or 7 per meal is going to make all the difference. And the other thing people often do is they do not moderate their protein per meal. And so if they are having good quality animal proteins in their meals, those are high in certain amino acids that will spike an insulin response, which they should, right? They're building, they're trying to build muscle, methionine and leucine. And so for people who do need consistent ketone energy, we modulate protein into a range that maintains muscle mass, and you can even build muscle with. But if the focus is on treating mental illness with KMT, you really might need to modulate that protein per meal. And that's kind of those are my secrets right there. Like, people come to me, 80% of the people who come to me are already on a ketogenic diet, but they're not getting treatment effects yet. And those are just some of the few things that I do that make the biggest difference for them.
Okay, this is really good. I want to go deeper into this. Somebody who is, say, lowering the carbs, and they're at the point where they're having, say, a ribeye and a salad for their lunch. They're eating in an eating window of, say, 6 hours. So they're having 2 meals, but they're having something like I just said, where it's a salad and a steak. So they're getting a lot of protein twice a day, but they still want to be within, say, that 6-hour eating window. Is that possible, eating the way you're talking about? Because I just want to be really practical for the person that is eating low carb, but they are relying on, say, a steak at lunch to feel full till dinner. So if they cut that down to the protein you talked about, what else can they put in there to feel full and then get these higher ketone levels?
For many, many people, that is just a beautiful, fine way to eat. Some people actually, I'll do their diet and I'll break it up into 3 meals a day so that the protein per meal is more moderate. And we do that for a little while, and then they find that when they intermittent fast, their ketone levels actually go up better. And so there's so much bio individuality with this and figuring this out. But yes, so if I was working with someone who we suspected needed to modulate protein or moderate protein per meal, then it would probably be, half that ribeye steak. They're welcome to have that beautiful salad. We would have them eat some pats of butter each bite with that steak to increase the fat. And we would make sure they had a beautiful, lovely, maybe olive oil dressing and not skimp on it.
Given the nuance here and how everybody's different, you mentioned bioindividuality. How important is testing if you're working with somebody, their ketone levels?
If it's to the point where they've come to me to fine tune it, testing is actually very important because it's a data point that I need in order to understand whether they do need to moderate their protein per meal, or if they might benefit from an intermittent fast or a slightly longer fast. Or, are they coming into their ketogenic diet with certain insufficiencies or deficiencies? So, for example, carnitine is something that we really look at when we're doing diets for this purpose. Somebody coming into their ketogenic diet that's vegan or vegetarian may need to rely much more on exogenous ketone supplementation like MCT oil, for example, because they are insufficient in carnitine or have trouble getting enough carnitine. Or maybe we need to supplement them carnitine because, again, if you don't have carnitine, you can't shuttle that fatty acid that you just ate or burned off your body into the mitochondrial membrane to make a ketone body. And if you're trying to fuel your brain on ketones, then you're in trouble, right? So potentially. So those are just some different nuances.
Okay, let's stick on carnitine. This is something I wanted to, again, make sure we got into. If somebody is eating an animal-based diet, is that deficiency ever something that comes up when you're working with people?
I've been doing this for many years now, and um, and and there's always this discussion that if the longer you're keto, the lower your blood ketone levels will be, and that's just normal because all of your tissues are sucking those ketones up and utilizing them better. And yes, that's true, but there's also a danger in not thinking a little bit more deeply about that. So people can become carnitine deficient. It's called carnitinemia. It's a mouthful. And there's actually some published literature in it in the epilepsy world. And they found that adults using a modified Atkins diet, so a modified Atkins diet isn't even about adding extra fat, right, to use up all the carnitine. It's just a therapeutic carbohydrate restriction sort of formulation. They can show up with hypocarnitinemia in as little as 1 to 3 months, right? So if someone is on a long-term low-carb ketogenic diet and their ketones start to get anemic, just kind of inconsistent or a bit flat or consistently low, I really do think it is important for them to go to their doctor and say, I am on a low-carb diet, and part of medically monitoring adults on a low-carb diet or a ketogenic diet is a carnitine panel. And if they come back and their free carnitine is 25 or less, they've got hypocarnitinemia, and in the epilepsy world, they actually supplement that. And I think that's important because carnitine insufficiency and deficiency has long kind of downstream chronic health implications. And so I think that our low carb communities that mostly do this for things like weight loss and that sort of thing have kind of missed the boat about getting that information from the epilepsy world because they don't feel well. They'll say like, oh, my ketones went down and, I'm starting to get symptoms again, or I don't feel well, or I'm tired. Fatigue is a big deal for low carnitine. And so I just think it's such an easy thing to supplement prophylactically or to just monitor with a doctor if you get labs anyways. And I just think it's kind of it's underutilized.
Okay, it sounds like it, but you're comfortable with somebody including that supplement just in general? It sounds like there's no harm in doing that. And if so, what dose?
Well, and here's the thing. So my field is mental health. And so there actually is, for people with bipolar disorder, there are, I think, 2 or 3 case reports that talk about people having, or they're wondering about the connection because case reports are not causal, right? We don't assume. But there was a very strong wondering about whether carnitine supplementation caused a potential manic episode. Now, none of those individuals were already on ketogenic diets where they obviously made ketones, right? So there could have been a disrupted metabolic system going on already that made worse somehow. I don't know. But so I wouldn't, if you have serious mental illness and you are not on a ketogenic diet and you are not carefully working with a dietitian who knows how to supplement carnitine and a psychiatrist and a provider, all that good stuff, I wouldn't just willy-nilly start supplementing carnitine. There might be no association truly at all, and it's just been, it's just been put together by practitioners trying to make connections for why manic episodes occurred, or there could be something to investigate there. So I wouldn't just do it careful. I wouldn't just go for it, right? So, but for people who are not using ketogenic diets as a treatment for mental illness, yeah, it is something that they can start to supplement. And what they'll find is, they can take some L-carnitine with a meal, and they might actually see their ketones improve pretty quickly. So within hours or just a day or so.
That's what I was going to ask. Any examples? You're working with somebody, they feel like they're doing the ketogenic diet right, but their ketones just aren't going up. They come to see you, you include the supplement, and then they just bump right up.
Happens all the time.
What kind of dose would somebody want to include?
Well, I wouldn't want to go into doses on a podcast type of thing, but I know that I can say that I know in the space lots of low carb people, and many of them who are on long term ketogenic diets. They will just do 500 milligrams every day, just prophylactically, to just try to keep those levels up overall.
Okay, just to be clear, somebody on an animal-based diet, and the way I understand it, red meat is the highest or one of the highest sources of carnitine.
Mm-hmm.
So if they're having a steak every day or every other day as part of that ketogenic diet, and they're getting that carnitine through the diet, over time they can still deplete and need supplementation.
Yes.
Okay, really important we go there, because if you did the search online and saw the carnitine availability in a steak, you would assume, okay, there's no way I'm going to run out.
Yeah.
For somebody that does, how long does that usually take?
Well, I don't know, because your body actually does put together some of its own carnitine on an as needed basis from other amino acids. And I think that there is differences, maybe it's in genetics, or there's personal differences in how well our body does that and to what level of abundance. And so I think that if we just look at the research literature that shows it can happen in as little as 1 to 3 months, right? Then we just need to, it's just something we need to pay attention to.
Coming back to our protein and the importance of spreading that out if you're finding you're not getting deep into ketosis, for me, that brings up the carnivore diet and people that are having these heavy meat diets. Do you find that people in that case working with you, some of them can get deep into ketosis with all that protein?
They do. I have people in my online program, for example, where they can have 45 grams, 50 grams of protein in a meal, and their ketones drop, but they don't drop too terribly, and they're back popped up in just an hour or two, and they do just fine. And then I have people where if I give them over 30 grams of protein per meal, their ketone production stops or gets very low, and they have symptoms. And so, like I said, it's just so different for everybody.
If you're working with somebody and their mental health's improving, they're keto, they're producing good ketones, but they're worried about long-term ketosis, do you feel that somebody on this diet for mental health has any reason to spike insulin periodically to maintain a healthy metabolism?
I don't. I will say, though, that anyone who does a ketogenic diet long term, there's just going to be instances where you're out of ketosis and your insulin got spiked anyways, either by accident or, that sort of thing. So there's people who've done ketogenic diets for their whole lives for epilepsy from childhood on that have been healthy and have not needed to spike their insulin, although I bet it's happened from time to time. And also, people go out of ketosis sometimes when they're sick, right? So when people are ill, sometimes the body will upregulate glucose as a fuel for immune cells, and they'll drop out of ketosis. And if they've got epilepsy, they'll have a seizure. And if they have mental illness, they might have some extra symptoms. So there's this idea that you stay in one metabolic state all the time through your whole life is just not how human bodies work. So yeah, I work with people also who have neurological conditions, and many of them have weight loss and that sort of thing. And you can absolutely formulate a ketogenic diet that keeps them from losing weight. Insulin doesn't have to be spiked. You make sure they have good amino acids, or you sometimes will supplement amino acids, right? If they need to be on a higher ratio. So there's all kinds of things that we can do. But I've been on a ketogenic diet for 8 or 9 years now. And there has been moments where I've had extra berries that I'm sure was, an out of control insulin spike, but I'm still on a ketogenic diet overall. So again, this kind of black and white thinking I don't think is really reflective of real life.
Let's get into your story. 8 or 9 years ago, you went keto. What was your diet like before? And what was it for you decided to make that switch?
Oh, that's a long story. I don't think all your people want to hear about my long story. So, and I also
do. Let's do it.
I don't talk about it that often because it's like, it was hard. It was like a hard million years ago type of thing, and I'm just not in that place anymore. But the gist of it was I had a pain syndrome. I got put on a lot of medications. And then I had an operation that fixed the pain syndrome, but they couldn't get me off of the medications. I was one of those people where the bridge medications they used to detox people off of those was not working, and I was stuck. So I was stuck on them for a long time, which had real cognitive effects for me, among others. And then finally got me on a bridge medication. Then I got stuck on the bridge medication, could not get off, ended up finding an experimental protocol, and that got me off, but it absolutely devastated me, my health, and my brain. And I thought that I was going to have to just give up my practice because I just could not function. It was bad, and when I looked back on it, I saw that I actually had the same symptoms that we find in stage 1 Alzheimer's. So I was quite impaired. And then thank goodness for podcast hosts, because I actually heard a talk by Dom D'Agostino on STEM Talk. And he was talking about ketogenic diets for Alzheimer's. And I thought, I wonder if I could do that. And there's no help back then for neurological conditions or anything. So I just figured it out. It took me a while. And I felt the lights come back on. And which I'm sure lots of your guests have talked about, that sensation of actually, my brain is working. I feel present. I'm not overwhelmed. My mood is good. I didn't even realize I was walking around anxious all the time until it went away. And that just put me on an incredible tear to make sure that my clients and my patients got access to this for that purpose. And so that's my story.
You talked about the moment of clarity and how this happens for others as well. What kind of timeline? Obviously, people have different disorders and different histories and such, but in a general sense, what kind of timeline can somebody expect when they go keto to get to that point?
So some people feel effects in like 4 days, and that was me. So my poor little brain was probably just starving for energy constantly. And so you can get it right away. And then there's other people where it takes many months, usually. And by many months, we always say give it 3 months. I think it should be give it 4 months, because sometimes it could take me a good month just to get your macros dialed in and get you into ketosis. So really, it's like, I would say give it 4 months of consistency. But usually there's some kind of clue in there. You just get some little clue that you're functioning better, or you have more days where you feel a little bit better. And then you might have days that you feel bad. But the way I describe it to people is, when we do this in the epilepsy world, when we initiate a ketogenic diet for seizure control, those people in the beginning are still getting seizures for a few months. It's just that the seizures start to happen less often. There's shorter prodromal phases. They are less severe. right? So it's like lots of seizures in the beginning, and then and these are the good days and these are the bad days, right? And so over time, it starts to do this, right? And so sometimes it's this life-changing, oh my God, my brain has turned on. And sometimes it's like this, where you just start to notice an increase in capacity, where you start to have 5 good days in a row, and then maybe you'll have 7 bad days. But then the 5 days came back and it was 10 days this time, right? Before the 3 days of bad. Like, that's what healing a brain looks like. It's messy. And so people need to understand that when they do KMT, they're working to heal a brain. It's not just about symptom control. We're not giving them a drug that's supposedly going to squash their symptoms. We're actually healing the underlying metabolic dysfunction that is causing those symptoms. So it can be 4 days, it can be 4 months, and it can be 7 months. And really, I would say keep your eye on the prize. Do it as long as you need.
What would you say is the long tail on being on a diet like keto? You've been on it 8-9 years. Do you feel like there's still more brain healing happening at that point?
I don't know about brain healing, although I would say in our modern world, I'm sure my noggin needs healing by the end of every day, right? To some degree. But I am, before my illness, I was in graduate school, and I was one of those people who could look at a textbook and I could remember the words on the page and the passage and the number. Like I was on it. I was a smart cookie. I never got that ability back, but your brain rebuilds itself based on what but I haven't needed to, right? Because your brain rebuilds itself and remodels itself based on the work that you put in front of it and what you do. And so, do I have the same brain I had when I was, 27 in graduate school? No, I kind of like my brain better now. I find it more useful, and I think I'm actually more wise and smart overall. And so, I forget your question now, but that was the gist of it. Like, yeah, I think my brain gets better and better the longer I'm on a ketogenic diet, and that's what a lot of other people say that use it for this purpose.
When you're working with people, somebody a year in, 2 years in, they've seen, say, 80% improvement, but they're concerned that this is it, I'm not going any further. This is just to expand on what you just said. Do you feel like 3-4 years in, sometimes these people are still healing?
Because the brain is so plastic, I wouldn't call it healing necessarily anymore. I would say it's remodeling. Right? I mean, it might be, like I said, this is a rough environment to have a brain, right? So yes, they're healing all the time, but yes, remodeling. So if you don't have the brain you want, there might be some potential micronutrient insufficiencies that you still have that you haven't addressed. That might be specific to you, specific needs. It might be that you are not doing your mental push-ups. So if you want big mental arms and you're not doing push-ups and you're not taking yourself outside of your comfort zone, you might not be giving your brain the stimulus it needs to wire itself in the way you like, right? So it's a full kind of lifestyle intervention, and so your brain needs to know what you want from it.
To me, what I've gathered so far talking to you is there's 2 different aspects to supporting the brain. One being the ketones, and 2 being micronutrients.
Yeah.
So let's focus on the latter. How do you make sure if somebody's on a keto diet, they're producing ketones? That's great. But how do you make sure they're getting the nutrition they need? We did talk about carnitine, but beyond that, to support the brain.
Yeah, so I also have training in functional nutrition, and so I'm very very aware of the need for micronutrient sufficiency and amino acid sufficiency in order to make the enzymes a body needs and a brain needs, and to neurotransmitters and all that good stuff. I think that is an underutilized lever in ketogenic metabolic therapy. So they track. I look at their food. I prefer Chronometer as a tracker. because it has the best kind of micronutrient food database that's available. It's not perfect, but it gives me a starting point. I can see if they get the basic RDIs. And I also know that the RDIs are not the gospel in terms of what optimal functioning needs, right? So they're just kind of like what you need to just try not to get a chronic disease or illness. My bar is a little bit higher for the people I work with. And so the way I think about it, and I talk about this all the time, is the ketones are kind of like the labor, the energy, and the micronutrient and amino acid sufficiency are the materials. And if they're going to rebuild a brain, you need both. You can't have all these workers on site, but there's insufficient materials, and you cannot have all these materials. So these people that are trying to supplement themselves out of cognitive impairment, that is not going to work. You can have all the materials in the world on your site, but if you do not have the energy to utilize them, you are not going to get very far, or you're going to plateau in what you can experience. And so I really do believe you need both.
When it comes to the micronutrient piece, besides a healthy diet, what supplements do you like to see people taking?
I really think people need to pay attention to magnesium, because there's just, I know that there's like a little magnesium bar in Chronometer, but I do not think it's accurate, because I don't think they have retested all those foods in our current food environment to understand that the percentage of magnesium in the foods are going down. So I just think magnesium is an absolute necessity and a no-brainer, and to not skimp on magnesium, right? And I think that just for enzyme function, you just really need to be replete in magnesium. And then I put people on a good quality multivitamin. Sometimes, depending on what's going on, sometimes I'll put them on a B complex and a trace mineral supplement. People on ketogenic diets, I think, do better with more minerals. And those are kind of the basics that I do. And then, of course, during the initiation phase, we make sure we add on potassium. Sometimes we, if they don't eat dairy, for example, we pay attention to calcium. So again, these are good questions for nutrition professionals around how to fine-tune their individual nutrition.
One supplement that's been talked about for a long time in our world, creatine,
Mm-hmm.
more so for bodybuilders before, now also in the brain realm.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about that, somebody with a mental illness?
I feel pretty good about it. And, I think that the research coming out about it as a substrate that's utilized in the brain in a positive manner is actually great. And so, yeah, I think I almost think about creatine a little bit as a nootropic in its own right. And I think that it is very beneficial, and I think it helps with holding on to muscle as we age. And I cannot think of a negative to go with it at this point. So it is one that I have people supplement in my online program, particularly for depression. Yeah.
I have heard that it can battle against being in ketosis. I haven't gone deep into looking into that, but do you ever find that can tamp down ketone production?
I have not had that experience with people at all. For myself, where I have 10 in my coffee right now, 10 grams. And if I took my ketones right now, they would not be low. And I haven't experienced that in my program either, or private consultation. So I'm curious about that.
Okay, good to know. What about fish oil? Another one associated with the brain.
Mm-hmm.
We'll expand out to omega-3s. If somebody is not having fish, is that something you like to see them supplementing with?
I do. And it doesn't need to be a giant dose. So generally, I don't recommend over 2 grams of fish oil if they're on a healthy, well-formulated ketogenic diet. Sometimes it can cause fatty acid imbalances in terms of 6:3 ratios. But, I've also heard other researchers talk about how there really isn't an upper limit on omega-3s and that there may be increased benefits at higher amounts. And I've heard that about creatine as well, that maybe the body doesn't have an upper limit and it will just utilize it. So, but yeah, I really do recommend people get their omega-3s from food because there's so many amazing micronutrients in fish and in the food that they all work together in this really kind of mysterious, beautiful way that just taking a supplement isn't going to do it.
Any thoughts on methylene blue? This is something that is taking the health world by storm, related to brain health. Is it something you ever work with clients and suggest? Try yourself? How do you feel about it?
I feel like the beautiful people I work with have very sensitive brains. And I think that the people I work with often have genetic SNPs around MAO. And I know from just some preliminary research that there are some people with differences in MAO that do not do well with methylene blue. And so it's not something that I play with and I would not implement just because I'm not knowledgeable enough about it to not potentially do harm, right? And so, yeah, people don't come to me for that.
Okay, a few supplements I think could be helpful early on. You did mention MCT oil, exogenous ketones, and electrolytes. So let's talk to those early on in the ketogenic journey and then potentially later.
So electrolytes, everybody thinks they're doing electrolytes well, and I don't think they potentially are. So in the dietitian world, one of the electrolyte protocols is just to use something called light salt, Morton's light salt. That is a perfect blend of potassium and sodium. And part of that is because some medically fragile populations have heart issues and they really do need that kind of perfect ratio in terms of electrolyte supplementation. Doesn't address the magnesium issue at all that way. And so I really like to have people use small doses of potassium, magnesium, and salt throughout the day. Because the thing about an electrolyte imbalance, it's not something that you can drink a couple elements or a couple Redmond, relights or whatever and call it good during that first initiation stage. You really do need quite a bit of sodium potentially to avoid the keto flu. And so I have my people break up those doses throughout the day.
And then MCT oil and exogenous ketones.
MCT oil, I think of as something on top of your own exogenous ketone production. So I don't put people on ketogenic diets and immediately give them MCT oil and then see a BHB reading that's 1.0 and consider that success, because a lot of that is the MCT oil. And I have no idea if the modifications in metabolism, that shift has happened well enough to get them into ketosis and sustained ketosis. So MCT oil might be something that I add on later. The people who tolerate MCT oil do really, really well with it. And the people who do not tolerate it have a hard time working up to it in a big enough dose that it can really cushion or provide enough ketones for people to get treatment effects, in my experience. So some people can easily tolerate 3 tablespoons 3 times a day with meals. And there's actually, in the epilepsy world, there's something called an MCT oil diet. The protein is very, very low, in my opinion, and not really sustainable. The carbohydrates are, I think, up to 14% of calories can be carbs, but that's because 70% of the fat they eat is MCT oil. So they're not really making ketones on their own. They're cushioning it with an exogenous. And then my question would be, are they actually getting the metabolic effects they need of a reduced carbohydrate intake? So yes, MCT oil is great. Not everybody can tolerate it. Don't drink a bunch of MCT oil and make ketones and think that you are in the clear. right? Or that you're getting the same treatment effects as someone who has restricted their carbohydrates down low enough or has dealt with a carnitine deficiency that kept their ketones low in the first place. And then exogenous, the other exogenous ketone, or one of the other exogenous ketones, is BHB salts. Those are lovely. They provide a nice source of minerals for people. They tend to be more expensive, and so I don't really pull those out for people unless they're not getting good treatment effects, or I suspect that they've got some cognitive impairment that would just benefit from an additional topping off of the fuel tank of that BHB. And I do work with a lot of low-income and disabled people where that's an expensive supplement for them to use that. But for biohackers, no, they'll just go for that and take that. I do not recommend ketone esters for people using ketogenic diets for mental illness. And the reason for that is some of the preliminary data coming out for certain ketone esters are showing that it can be difficult on the liver. And a lot of my people that I work with are on a lot of psychiatric medications that are already really a burden on their liver function. And we see it in their labs, right? So why would I give them a ketone ester that's possibly going to add to that burden? And also, some ketone esters will actually create a physiological state in which ketones and glucose raise at the same time, and that's not really a state that we see happen naturally, and so it's suspect to me.
Any thoughts on whether or not, if somebody decides to take ketones exogenously, that can tamper down their own production?
I have not seen that. So a BHB drink generally will increase ketones by 1 millimole, and I've had lots of people, I will sometimes use exogenous ketones. I haven't seen the next day or any issue with my ketone levels.
Okay. I've heard both ways. I know Dr. Boz says ketones begets more ketones when you take them, but I've also heard they can bring that production down. So just curious.
Yeah, I haven't had that experience clinically. It's so funny because there are a billion questions that there have not been studies for yet about things like that. So many little nuances that it just have not been looked at carefully yet.
Any thoughts on taking lithium orotate for the brain?
I'm actually part of a functional psychiatry fellowship, and I actually do trainings for them on ketogenic diets. It's called Psychiatry Redefined, and the psychiatrist that trains in that particular program, Dr. Greenblatt, he has been a strong proponent for nutritional lithium for many, many years. And yes, I think there are neuroprotective factors to lithium or effects of very low dose nutritional lithium.
We did talk about fasting earlier, but I'm curious, if you're working with somebody, at what point along the journey would you bring that in, and what would it look like?
I will sometimes bring fasting in if they've fallen out of ketosis for some reason and I want to get them into ketosis quickly. So I might put them on a BHB drink and have them fast, and it won't be a sweetened BHB drink because I don't want a cephalic insulin response. But yeah, so sometimes fasting is the best way to get back on the wagon and get your ketone production back up. After there's been an accidental drop or off of the ketogenic diet, for example, or sometimes a purposeful one, and then I need to get back on. That wasn't a good idea. So fasting can actually be very helpful in that way. There's people who have really a lot of insulin resistance that do really well with intermittent fasting as a protocol. I think it helps heal the underlying insulin resistance that might make it difficult for them to get into ketosis and stay in ketosis. So I see it as a therapeutic tool that we can bring in.
So we've talked a lot about ketones for the brain, being an additional energy source there. Let's expand out and talk about the other benefits of ketosis and ketones for the brain and body.
I was really kind of surprised. So I work with a lot of really wonderful researchers in the space. And one of them said something that really surprised me, and that's when I kind of knew that the whole space was really going to blow up. And what they said is that we were probably always supposed to be in ketosis at least most of the time or a lot of the time in our evolutionary history. And it might be that the ketones were actually organ stabilizers. So being in ketosis might be one of the ways in which our body maintains homeostasis in our organs, including our brain. And so the high carbohydrate environment that we currently eat from might actually be suppressing the very thing that we need for vibrant health or for a healthy body, period. So ketones, my goodness, there's so many different ways that they affect things. So we talked about the blood-brain barrier and leaky gut and how butyrate might provide a fuel to fuel that. And we can also talk about, well, you want to talk about ketones. I will pop on in there. We talked about supplements, so there's one thing I want to just throw in, but you make sure I get back on track with your question after, which is your gut microbiome completely shifts over in about 2 weeks on a ketogenic diet. You get a completely different gut microbiome. And what's really fascinating to me, and I smile because I just see so many gut protocols in the functional medicine world, right? Constantly trying to throw probiotics at you to heal your leaky gut or to fix your gut. And that's a real problem with a lot of my patients or my clients because the ketogenic diet is actually trying to downregulate many of those microbiome strains that are in those very probiotics that were formulated with in mind people who eat carbohydrates, right? So the microbiome shift that occurs on a ketogenic diet is actually thought to be responsible for the improvements in neurotransmitter balance that occur between GABA and glutamate in that system. So you'll find some practitioners like me and a few others will talk about how they'll have a beautifully recovered person who used to be in psychosis and is no longer come in the office and talk about having symptoms. And you ask them what is different and you keep digging in and finally it's, oh yeah, I just added this probiotic, right? So I really want people to be careful about the supplements. Do not throw the kitchen sink at yourself or let a functional practitioner throw the kitchen sink at you if you are on a ketogenic diet, because they really have not thought through the biochemistry of what's happening on these multiple pathways. And I don't think the clinical know-how is there yet to determine whether something they're throwing at you is helping or hurting or getting in the way of what your ketogenic diet is trying to do. But ketones, yes. So ketones, so BHB is its own antioxidant that has antioxidant properties all by itself. And it also is a molecular signaling body. So as a molecular signaling body, it is turning all kinds of genes off and on. And one of the things that it turns off is chronic inflammation. It keeps that acute inflammation, right? So if you cut yourself, you're still going to get lots of inflammation to heal that, but it helps turn down and off some of those chronic inflammatory pathways that are just so out of control. There's immune system regulation that happens on a ketogenic diet. So ketogenic diets are being used, for example, for Hashimoto's, and they found that there's a decrease in inflammation in the thyroid in individuals with Hashimoto's that are on a ketogenic diet. And so there's so many different kind of effects that ketogenic diets have and the ketone production. So again, I think of them as really powerful molecular signaling bodies that are neural network stabilizers and organ stabilizers that really kind of tell our genes how to function and provide a particular environment for our genes to express themselves in ways that they are meant to.
Somebody coming to you, whether they be male or female, any difference in how you prescribe the ketogenic diet?
Any difference in how well?
And then different phases of life. Because for women, we have, before menopause, perimenopause, menopause.
Yeah.
Just with the different hormones, if you approach it any differently?
So you do not need carbohydrates to regulate your hormones. There is an increase in carbohydrate cravings that can occur during certain times of a woman's cycle. And that is easily managed with extra berries or some extra dark chocolate or something like that. That's a craving but there's lots of people, lots of women who have used ketogenic diets for epilepsy control their whole life, and their hormones have not gone awry in any way, shape, or form. Ketogenic diets are not a stressor. My goodness, there's so much information. If you're chronically under eating because you just reduced your carbohydrates, but you didn't increase energy and fat, then yes, that's a stressor. If you are under eating protein, yes, that's a stressor. So it's really interesting. There's this psychological thing that happens where whenever anything starts to go off kilter, we immediately think it must be that ketogenic diet, which is really kind of ridiculous. But that's what our brains do, because our brains are trying to find reasons. And that's the most obvious, biggest change that's occurred in the last 6 months or a year for someone, right? Or 3 months. So, the other thing is, I can't tell you how many people are like, oh, my T3 is low and I don't feel very good on a ketogenic diet. And we just actually give them some iodine and suddenly their thyroid numbers improve. Again, I suspect it's that substrate. So if I've suddenly got a bunch of workers who can do work on what needs to happen, and I have a low level of materials, they're going to use up those materials, right? So is a low T3 due to improved hormone receptor functioning on a ketogenic diet? Yes, for sure. Is it also possibly because they have used up their iodine stores trying to heal tissues? I think it's possible. Yes. So there's all these different pieces, but it much more depends on, the person. Are they underweight? Are they overweight? Are they an athlete? Do they need more energy? Are they are they at a certain age where modulating their protein down to improve ketone production makes me want to add an amino acid supplement to help maintain their muscle mass and some creatine? Everybody listening, you deserve one or two, sometimes you can come to someone like me in the field and they can help you with this stuff in just 1 or 2 sessions, as opposed to just, closing your eyes and winging it. So sometimes that can be really helpful.
I'm glad you brought up iodine. That's another supplement I wanted to cover with you. A lot of controversy around it. A lot of people avoiding it because of that. Go more into how you feel about iodine and supplementing.
So yes, that's like a whole nother rabbit hole. I have many rabbit holes that I enjoy going down. Ketogenic diets are just one of them. And anybody who has recovered from a ketogenic diet doing the absolute opposite of everything the medical establishment has told them suddenly understands that all things are suspect and open to reevaluation. So iodine was one of those things for me. So when I first started my ketogenic diet, not first, probably a few months in, I knew I was eating enough protein. I knew I was having plenty of amino acids. I knew I was having plenty of calories and energy. I had it dialed in. I knew what I was doing, and I was still getting a lot of hair loss. I could not figure it out. And then I learned about iodine insufficiency and deficiency in our population and how severe it is. And I started adding iodine, and my hair stopped falling out. And so I had subclinical hypothyroidism, not because of my ketogenic diet, not because I was under eating, but because my nutrient stores of iodine had gone down, because I was healing in other tissues. And it's not just your thyroid that uses iodine, your breasts, your skin, your brain, right? If I'm healing a brain, it's using my iodine, I promise you. So I'm not afraid of iodine. I know that there are prescribers that are concerned about iodine and lithium and all that, different things. But I think that it is an essential nutrient, and I see people do much better on it than when we are stingy with it and fearful.
I want to come back to the gut microbiome. We did talk about fiber early on. You just got into the other realm of microbiome, but I want to bring fiber back in because a lot of people going on a ketogenic diet are going to bring their fiber down. They don't have to, depending on how they do the diet, but a lot of people, including more animal products, will. You touched on butyrate, but let's talk about this in a general sense. Somebody that's worried about bringing their fiber level down.
So fiber is not an essential nutrient. There is not a required amount of fiber. Some of my people really feel better with fiber. They say that their digestion is better with fiber, but a lot more people tell me their digestion gets better without fiber. And I think that for some people, they have gut microbiomes that somehow figure out how to make a carbohydrate out of fiber. I don't know how they do it, but they do. And so I really don't focus on fiber with my people or try to make sure they get a certain amount. Again, why do I need fiber when I have a constant source of butyrate healing their gut? The whole point of increasing fiber for many people is to help make butyrate in the condition of no butyrate, because they're never in ketosis because their insulin levels are too high all the time.
Okay, so no probiotics. The gut will take care of itself, is what I gathered from what you said before when we go keto.
Mm-hmm.
Let the gut sort itself out.
Mm-hmm.
Stop feeling like we need to put fiber in and probiotic supplements and manipulate that. Would that be fair?
That would be that's fair, and that's a good starting point. I do get people in my program, for example, who had to go on antibiotics and they feel like their gut microbiome is not recovering. And when that happens, there is a soil-based probiotic that I will put people on, but it works by a different mechanism than throwing down a big old probiotic bomb. And so, yeah.
When we're working on the brain, I would assume alcohol is out, but you can elaborate on that if you feel the need to.
Absolutely out.
You're drinking coffee, so you're not opposed to coffee and caffeine.
No, but I will say that ketogenic brains are more sensitive to all substances because they are healthier. So you cannot hammer them with high doses of substances. And so this is my second cup of coffee today. And really, if I was being honest with myself, I would probably do better with just 1 cup a day. I probably don't need to.
So potentially we would need to moderate the amount when we go keto.
Yes.
But is there ever a point in the journey, maybe even early on, where you recommend caffeine get removed?
It depends on the situation a little bit. Yeah. So it's a substance. This just opens up a whole nother thing. How much time do we have? So I work with people who work towards psychiatric recovery. And the first step for that is ketogenic metabolic therapy, done very, very well. And the second step of that is often titration down on their medications. And that means that I need to send them off for information about hyperbolic tapering. And information about hyperbolic tapering talks about how sometimes when you are trying to reduce your medications, you will adapt better if you go off of caffeine first and nicotine and different substances, which makes perfect sense, yes, because the brain is trying to recalibrate itself as medications are being reduced. So yes, there's some instances where I will encourage people to go down on their caffeine or even eliminate it for a particular purpose. If I have someone who is on their ketogenic diet, this happens a lot actually. They're on their ketogenic diet and they're used to their 4 cups of coffee, but they've just got so much anxiety and they don't know why. That is someone that I will be, oh no, you need to reduce your caffeine intake now. You don't need it to do the terrible, terrible fatigue that you normally experienced on your antipsychotic medications. And if you do, then your medications might be too high. And it might be time to work with your prescriber to titrate them down carefully.
Somebody going keto, they're on a medication or multiple for their mental health. How do you work differently with that person?
The services I provide are education and support, and nutrition. And I I do not go into the realm of the medication piece. I'm trying to be very, very careful about that because I'm not a prescriber and I'm not trained in that. It might mean I lower their carbohydrates down even more than 20 net. I might put them on 10 or 15 net, trying to get their ketone levels up because of the side effects of those medications. And really, that is something that they have to work with their prescriber about. But I will tell you and your listeners that every psychiatrist feels like, and family doctor feel like they are very good at titrating medication. They'll tell you that they know exactly what they're doing, but I have seen many beautifully, sustainably recovered individuals be taken down on their medication much too fast in ways that are not what should be the standard, which is hyperbolic tapering. Hyperbolic tapering is much slower, much more careful, much more considerate of the fact that some of these people have been on multiple medications for 30 years and that the research saying someone's on them for 8 weeks can get off just fine. You can't apply that same algorithm to my patients, to my people. So they will get rebound psychosis and think their ketogenic diet stopped working when really the prescriber has caused a withdrawal injury or an effect. And how do I know this? Because once they are restabilized and they are properly titrated down in a hyperbolic manner, they do not relapse.
The other thing I think it's important we get into in this realm is potentiation.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody going keto, other end of the spectrum, they're on their medication and things can start to go haywire. So talk about that.
One of the things I like about my online program is that someone can come on a Q&A with me until I retire the program someday. And that's actually very useful because I have found that potentiation effects seem to happen every 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes every 3 months, depending on the person and the dose. And often it's very difficult for my clients to keep in mind that new sensations or side effects might actually be potentiation. So they'll think like, oh, my ketogenic diet isn't working anymore, when really they're getting anxiety from their SSRI now that hasn't been adjusted in 6 months, but they're on a ketogenic diet with a totally different brain, and stuff like that. So potentiation is where your brain, well, it can be, that word can be used for many things. So potentiation can happen right away with antipsychotics because the increase in fat intake changes how those medications are metabolized and can actually make them stronger. So sometimes just starting your ketogenic diet means your medications need to be carefully adjusted down because you'll be more sleepy and have more side effects from your antipsychotics. And then sometimes people heal really fast and do really well, and the same dose of antipsychotic that made them sleep 14 hours is now making them sleep 18 hours. And that's just not a good quality of life. And they need a prescriber who's open and willing to titrate that down a little bit to see if that improves. And, sometimes the potentiation effects are medication side effects that the person didn't have prior. So sometimes they'll start having digestive upset or digestive problems or nausea, and they'll think, oh, it's this fat and it's this ketogenic diet. And I'm like, well, why don't you work with your prescriber to titrate down and that nausea goes away? And when you look at the pamphlet for that medication, nausea was a side effect. So that's what potentiation looks like. And that's why it's really nice to be part of a community or work with a practitioner who has experience in this to kind of help you troubleshoot or think about what else it could be.
Somebody on this journey, they go keto for a period of time. They get stability with their mental illness, whatever that is for them. How often do you see somebody at that point where they get to a level of healing where they can include more carbs if they choose to and still feel good?
So we don't have any research on this yet. This is one of those questions that people really want to know. So in the epilepsy world, there absolutely are people who do ketogenic diets for 1 to 5 years, and they're able to either completely come off the diet and go back to pizza and root beer, or they can increase their carbohydrates to something much more liberal than they thought possible. So there's something called a low glycemic index diet. Many people will, which is just a ton of carbs. I don't understand how that diet works, but it works. It can work for people, and they can move to something like that. After you've done 20 net carbs for a very long time, moving to 40 to 60 net carbs feels like a huge abundance. You don't even know how to eat that many carbs at that point. And some people go up to, 80 to 100. We just don't know the answer to that. But I would say don't assume you have to be on the diet your whole life. I suspect that as the brain heals and as the metabolic dysfunction in the brain is repaired, there is more resiliency that happens. And you just don't know what's possible in 5 or 10 years.
Somebody still on the journey, say they're only 7-8 months in, they're feeling a lot better, they're keto, but they go to a party and they decide to have a piece of cake and it kicks them out of ketosis. How often do you see that causing problems long term and resetting a lot of the accomplishments and healing they've gotten?
So that kind of behavior or that kind of instance is actually published in the peer-reviewed literature in some of the early case reports by Chris Palmer, where people had resolved psychosis and then went off the diet and got floridly psychotic and had to be hospitalized, put on first-generation antipsychotic medications, and then stabilized, kept on the ketogenic diet, and then slowly tapered off again. And I've had experiences with clients where it's caused a manic episode, even though they've been on it for 7 to 8 months. But it wasn't one time. They went off. It was one giant Rice Krispie treat, for example, at a Starbucks, right? New job, new functioning, recovered, went to Starbucks with new coworkers, thought this shouldn't hurt, and then went into a manic episode after and then lost that job. And then I've also had people who had the piece of cake, just didn't feel very good, got some mood symptoms, and decided to just go back on their ketogenic diet.
But the healing that's happened in the background, somebody that makes that choice has the carbs. Do you feel like the healing continues with the progress they've made, or it's a big step back?
I think it depends on how big the assault is on the brain metabolism. I think it depends on how sensitive their brain is at that time when that occurs.
Giving your position, working with people, getting the joy of seeing somebody go on this diet and feel better, can you share a couple of instances of people that were in a bad place, adopted what we've been talking about, and the progress they've made?
I can generally. I don't want to share people's, private stories on a podcast without their permission.
Yeah, general's great.
General's great. So I have worked with individuals who were able to have a wedding and get married without psychotic symptoms getting in the way of their enjoyment of that event. I know that person would be fine with me sharing that. I love my nonprofit and my online program. So I should tell you that, and I'm going there because that's kind of the best way to kind of share some of the stories. So I have a nonprofit for individuals who are low income or government disabled due to psychiatric illness that puts them into my paid online program. And we're actually doing a matching campaign for the whole month of July 2026. And that gives them scholarships into this program. And so in this program, it's amazing because we share Friday wins every Friday. And I cannot tell you the level of increased capacity that they celebrate with one another in this online program and in the Q&As. So I've got people going and getting jobs who could not work. I've got people starting college that could not before. I have people reporting improved relationships within their family. So every 3, 6, 9 months and a year and 2 years in, we send out these things and these questions that they answer. Have you been able to go back to work? Have you been able to start school? Have you increased any hobbies? Have your relationships improved? And if so, with whom? Has it been helpful to have a support person enrolled with you? Those kinds of questions. And so really, it's just really kind of been profound, the feedback that we get for our nonprofit participants who have entered the online program. And they're out doing more. When you feel well, your whole world expands on so many levels. So, things like I talked to a stranger at a coffee shop and I actually enjoyed it and it didn't freak me out. Like those are the early ones where they're like, oh, wait a minute, I couldn't do that before, right? Or they'll be like, I read a book. Like I couldn't read before because my cognitive symptoms from my medication were so debilitating, I couldn't focus. Like these are big, big deals. And so I work with a lot of people with serious mental illness, but I also want to say for the people listening, if you feel like your brain is meh, it's okay, it's good, it might be worth it to switch fuel sources and see how your brain feels on ketones. You might be a race car using the wrong fuel and not even know it.
On the other end of the spectrum, anybody you've worked with that's done ketogenic correctly and not seen any difference in their mental health?
Absolutely. There are non-responders to ketogenic metabolic therapy, and we don't know exactly why or who that is or for what purposes that's occurring. And so they've done it a long time or for several months and they didn't feel any benefits. I sometimes wonder if medications can make it difficult for people to feel results on a ketogenic diet. I have had people where they didn't feel results, but they were stable. They started titrating down on medications, and then they started to feel better. Now, was that because of their ketogenic diet, or was it because they were having side effects from their medications? I don't know. Again, there's so much we don't know. But yes, someone can do a ketogenic diet perfectly and beautifully and still not get treatment effects. It happens.
Somebody doing this diet, but they want to do everything they can. What other metabolic therapies besides keto would you recommend to somebody, whether it be sleep, exercise, any of the big pillars that you find make a big difference with this diet?
I find that those other metabolic psychiatry interventions tend to work much better in the context of someone in a ketogenic metabolic state. Part of that is I think that ketogenic diets help modulate some of the side effects of the medications that most people are on with serious mental illness, or any mental illness. And so, I mean, think about it. If I'm on a medication that reduces my dopamine function, am I going to be motivated to go running? No. Right? So this idea that, people with mental illness should just do all of these kind of behavioral modification things when we're literally squashing the neurochemistry that it takes to be motivated to do those things is a pretty heartless thing for us to do. So what I always like is I like to have someone on a ketogenic diet and then their energy goes up, how their functioning goes up. And then we add in things like exercise. I like people to go to bed at the same time every night. And I like it to reflect whether it's dark outside or not. So same time every night, get up the same time every morning. I don't care if it's the weekend, you're healing a brain and you're prioritizing that. I want them to stop eating 2 to 3 hours before lights out so that their mitochondria understand what function it's supposed to be doing at that time. I want them to get light morning, noon, and evening. I want them to get the full spectrum. Again, their mitochondria is looking for data about what it needs to do. And so those are some of the things that are my go-tos for those pillars.
Early in the conversation, you brought up this moral aspect to this diet and some hang-ups people may have in that realm. Before we wrap up, I just want to give you a chance to talk on that.
So what prompted that comment, and not so much going keto specifically, although that is a thing, making their dietary decisions based on what they feel is a moral imperative as opposed to what we understand about human biochemistry. And they're totally okay to make that decision for themselves, but it doesn't change necessarily how their body works, that way. So things like I've had people who have gone keto and been told in online forums that they're killing the planet because they include animal protein in their ketogenic diet, and that if they're going to do this, they really need to do a vegan ketogenic diet. Otherwise, they're bad people. That sort of thing is kind of what I'm talking about. And again, if there is an agenda that says that eating meat is completely immoral or is, terrible for the planet or whatever, they're using epidemiological studies to promote that or prop that up. I really want people to do what you need to do to thrive. That is the absolute best thing you can do for your planet, your family, humanity, yourself. Please do not sacrifice yourself for a moral ideal that you then just completely decompensate underneath. I see that. I see a lot of people come to me on vegan and vegetarian diets who want me to construct ketogenic diets for them, and I'm happy to do that. And people do get good results doing vegan and vegetarian ketogenic diets. But I am struck by the level of deficiencies that they have in their diet, and I'm struck with also how chronically ill they became before they found a different modulation of diet. So it's just that. It's my bias. It's my bias that I think human beings do best on animal protein, and I put it out there, and I tell people in my program that, and the vegans and vegetarians come anyways, and I help them, and it's beautiful. But I don't like people telling my clients trying to heal that they are somehow bad people because they're doing what they need to get better.
So the vegans and vegetarians working with you can heal. You made that clear. But do you feel they can get the same results as somebody including animal products?
I don't know, because I have such a strong bias that I think that would color my cognitive schema about how I'm taking in information about how they're doing.
Fair enough. Last question for today. Somebody who is going to embark on this diet, give keto diet a try for their mental health. What would you say is one thing they should know going into this?
What is one thing they should know going into this?
I mean, we've shared a ton here, but just as one final thought.
Yeah.
Words of encouragement, maybe.
Yeah.
Somebody gonna embark on this journey.
You can do this without the cooperation of people around you. You don't need their buy-in. You don't necessarily need their support, although some people do better with support. I have had so many people who are so debilitated and struggling and had family members that would bring Oreos in the house that were just so determined to feel better, it did not stop them in any way, shape, or form. They simplified the ketogenic diet. They made ground beef and some fatty sauce, and they just ate off of it for a week until they were in ketosis, and they started to feel better, and they started to be able to do it. So I actually have two. One, you don't need a cheering squad cheering you on. Your pure, desperate determination to do it can be enough. And although I do enjoy supporting people, but don't feel like you have to have, everyone in your family not eating carbs with you. And the other thing is the brain that you start your ketogenic diet with is unlikely the same brain that you will have a month later, and it's not the same brain you'll have 2 months later and 3 months later. So as you start to get treatment effects, you will find it easier and easier and easier to implement your ketogenic diet. It gets easier. So don't assume that the level of debilitation that you have currently is what you're going to be trying to do a ketogenic diet with the whole 1 to 5 years you decide.
All right, Nicole, great place to wrap up. Thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. It's going to help a lot of people. We're going to link up your website, social media, your course, your nonprofit, everything in the show notes.
Great.
Thank you so much for the work you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for watching the episode. I have another great one lined up right here for you. Click on it and I'll see you over there.
What if your healthy diet has been the problem all along? That's what a lot of people are discovering. There's real power in feeding your brain properly and letting it try to heal itself. Nutrition and brain